Samuel Carter had lived most of his life in silence. His ranch stretched wide across the dry land, where the wind carried dust more often than voices. The sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of a windmill, and the thud of his boots on the wooden porch were the only company he knew. For years he had told himself that this life was enough. Hard work, the open land, and the endless horizon gave him purpose. But as the seasons passed and the years pressed on his shoulders, a quiet ache grew in his heart. He was tired of speaking only to the animals. He was tired of listening to his own footsteps echo in an empty house. He was tired of loneliness. That was when the idea of a mail-order bride first came to him. He had read about it in a newspaper that reached the general store in town once a month. Women in the city's back east, women who felt trapped in crowded streets or difficult homes, sometimes sought husbands in the west. The articles spoke of arrangements where men like him could exchange letters with these women, each hoping to find companionship across miles. At first, Samuel had pushed the thought aside. The notion of writing to a stranger asking her to cross half the country to marry him felt bold and almost foolish. Yet the nights on the ranch grew colder and lonelier, and the walls of his cabin seemed to lean in closer with every passing year. One evening, after a supper of beans and cornbread eaten in silence, Samuel lit a lamp and pulled out paper. His hand shook as he wrote. He described himself plainly: a rancher, quiet by nature, living far from town, with enough land and cattle to make a steady living. He wrote that he longed for a wife who was gentle, kind, and slim, someone who could bring light into the dark corners of his home. He folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and sent it away. For weeks afterward, he waited, though he told no one. He did not even allow himself to dream too much. Hope was a dangerous thing when a man lived alone. When the reply came, his heart nearly stopped. The woman's name was Clara. Her handwriting was neat, her words honest. She wrote of growing up in the city, where smoke and noise filled every day, and how she dreamed of wide skies and fresh air. She spoke of wanting a man who would be steady, faithful, and true. She agreed to come. Samuel read the letter over and over again until the paper grew soft at the edges. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of excitement, a sense that his days ahead might be brighter. The weeks leading up to her arrival were filled with nervous energy. Samuel worked harder than ever, fixing broken fence rails, painting the porch, even patching the roof of his cabin. He imagined Clara stepping into the home and noticing everything, and he wanted it to be perfect. He even bought a new shirt from town, though he felt awkward pulling it over his broad frame. Finally, the day arrived. Samuel woke before dawn, unable to eat much of his breakfast. He brushed his horse carefully, hitched it to the wagon, and rode toward town. The dusty road stretched long, but his thoughts stretched longer. He imagined Clara as he believed she would be: slim, gentle, soft-spoken, perhaps with a shy smile. His heart beat harder at the thought of finally seeing her. When he reached the town, people were already gathering near the stagecoach stop. News of mail-order brides always stirred curiosity, and Samuel felt the weight of many eyes upon him. He tried to ignore the whispers, the nudges between neighbors. He stood tall, his hat pulled low, waiting as the coach rumbled in. The horses snorted, the wheels groaned, and finally, the stage came to a halt in a cloud of dust. Samuel's chest tightened. The door opened. The first passenger stepped out, a thin man with a traveling bag. Another followed, then a woman with a child. Samuel's eyes scanned eagerly, searching for the delicate figure he had pictured so many times in his mind. Then the last passenger rose from her seat. The crowd grew quiet. A woman stepped to the door, tall and broad-shouldered, her body large and solid. She moved with careful steps, gripping the doorway as if aware of how much space she filled. The wooden steps of the wagon strained slightly as she placed her boot upon them. For a moment, Samuel's breath caught, not out of admiration, but out of surprise. This was not the woman he had imagined. The picture he had carried in his heart, the slim bride descending gracefully. Her dress fluttering in the wind shattered in an instant. The woman straightened, lifting her head proudly as she stepped onto the dusty street. Her dress stretched across her frame, her face glistened faintly from the long journey. but her eyes, clear, calm, and steady, met his without hesitation. She carried a small valise in her hand, and though the whispers of the townsfolk buzzed all around, she did not flinch. Samuel felt rooted to the ground. The image he had built in his mind battled fiercely with the truth before his eyes. This was Clara. This was the woman who had written those letters that had warmed his lonely nights. She was not slim, not delicate in the way he had hoped, but there was no shame in her stance, no apology in her eyes. She stood there as if to say, "Here I am, and I am enough." For a moment, Samuel did not move. Doubt pressed hard against him. The voices around him seemed louder now, the murmurs of townspeople judging, laughing, speculating. He felt heat rise in his face, but Clara's gaze did not waver. There was kindness there, but also strength, a quiet assurance that unsettled him more than her size. He stepped forward at last, removing his hat, his throat dry. "Clara?" he asked, his voice lower than he meant. She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Yes, and you must be Samuel." The sound of her voice, warm and steady, softened something in him. For all his shock, for all the crumbling of his expectations, there was a part of him that felt drawn to her. Not by appearance, not by the slim figure he had requested, but by the calm certainty she carried in her presence. As he took her valise from her hand, their fingers brushed. His heart, though tangled in confusion, beat with a strange new rhythm. Samuel realized then that the journey he had imagined one of hope fulfilled exactly as he had planned was gone. In its place stood a path he did not yet understand, one that might test him, surprise him, perhaps even change him. And as the wagon rolled away and the dust settled around them, Samuel knew one thing for certain: his life was no longer his own. The loner rancher, who had spent years waiting for a dream, had found a reality that would demand something different, something deeper than he had ever imagined. The first days after Clara arrived at the ranch were quiet and heavy. Samuel drove the wagon home with her beside him, and though he tried to speak, the words seemed to stick in his throat. He asked small things about her journey, whether she was tired, whether she needed water. She answered kindly, never showing annoyance, but her calm voice only made his silence feel louder. Samuel had dreamed of joy and excitement, of a slim bride who would fill the cabin with laughter and music. Instead, he found himself uncertain and guarded. Struggling with disappointment he dared not show too clearly. When they reached the ranch, Clara stepped down from the wagon and stood with her valise in hand, looking out over the wide land. The sun had dropped low, painting the sky in orange and gold. She drew a deep breath of the dry air and said softly, "It's beautiful here." Her words were simple, but Samuel noticed the way she meant them. She truly saw beauty in what he had long taken for granted. That night, Clara prepared supper while Samuel tended to the animals. When he came inside, the smell of stew and fresh bread surprised him. The table, often bare or hastily covered with his own poor meals, was set neatly. Clara moved with confidence in the kitchen, as though she had already decided this place would be her home. Samuel ate quietly, aware of how different it felt to share a meal with someone. Yet he still could not look at her without the shadow of his old expectations haunting him. The following days tested both of them. Samuel rose early, as he always had, to mend fences, herd cattle, and haul water. He expected Clara to stay indoors, perhaps struggling with the isolation. Instead, she tied her hair back, pulled on boots, and followed him outside. Without asking, she carried buckets, held tools, and even joined him in fixing a broken gate. Samuel wanted to tell her it was unnecessary, but he found no words. She worked steadily, her strength surprising him. Her hands grew rough quickly, but she did not complain. One morning, as Samuel struggled to lift a heavy beam for a new barn frame, Clara stepped forward and placed her shoulder beneath it. Together they raised it into place. Samuel looked at her in shock. No woman he had known before would have done such a thing. Clara met his gaze, breathing hard but steady, and said simply, "It's easier when to carry the weight." The words echoed in his mind long after. Still, Samuel could not let go of the image of the slim bride he had wanted. In town, whispers reached his ears. Neighbors asked how he liked his new wife, their voices carrying hints of laughter or pity. Samuel, embarrassed, answered shortly and left. Clara noticed his unease. At night, as they sat by the fire, she sometimes looked at him as if she wished to ask what troubled him. But she never did. She only smiled gently and spoke of small things, the stars, the weather, the sound of coyotes far off in the hills. Weeks passed. The rhythm of life changed, though Samuel hardly realized it at first. The cabin no longer felt hollow. Clara's presence filled the rooms, her steady footsteps, her humming while she cooked, her laughter when the chickens chased one another across the yard. Samuel found himself listening for these sounds, though he tried not to admit it. Slowly, the loneliness that had pressed upon him for years began to loosen. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains. The sky darkened, winds tore through the fields, and rain poured down in sheets. Lightning cracked and thunder roared. Samuel ran outside to drive the cattle into shelter. He expected Clara to stay safe inside, but when he turned, there she was. Her dress plastered with rain, her hair whipping in the wind. Without fear, she shouted instructions, helping to herd the animals toward the barn. Samuel shouted at her to go back, but she shook her head fiercely and kept moving, her strong frame steady in the storm. Together they fought the weather until every cow was safe. When they finally staggered inside, soaked and breathless, Samuel stared at her with new eyes. He realized then that she was not fragile like the bride he had imagined, but strong in ways he had never dreamed possible. After that day, something in Samuel softened. He began to speak more, to share small thoughts as they worked side by side. He noticed how Clara's laughter brightened even the hardest chores, how her patience calmed him when he grew frustrated, how she always seemed to see goodness where others saw only hardship. Slowly, the picture in his heart shifted. He no longer saw what she was not, but what she was: steady, capable, kind, and fiercely loyal. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in gold, Samuel and Clara sat on the porch together. The silence between them was no longer heavy but peaceful. Samuel cleared his throat, his hands tightening on his hat. "Clara," he said quietly, "you're not what I asked for." Clara looked at him, her expression calm. For a moment, Samuel feared he had hurt her, but she only waited, her eyes steady. He took a deep breath. "But you are everything I needed." The words, once held back for weeks, poured out with honesty. He told her of his loneliness, of his foolish expectations, of the picture he had built in his mind. He told her how he had struggled, but how little by little she had shown him something far greater than he had ever dreamed. Clara's eyes softened. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Samuel," she said, her voice steady but warm, "I never wanted to be anyone but myself. I came here hoping for a man who would see me as I am, not as an image in his mind. If you can do that, then we will be happy." For the first time in many years, Samuel smiled fully, the weight on his heart lifting. He realized that happiness had already begun to grow between them, in the laughter shared, in the work done side by side, in the strength they had discovered together. As the stars began to prick the sky, Samuel looked out over his land. It was no longer just a ranch. It was a home. And beside him sat the woman who had turned his loneliness into life. Not by fitting into his dreams, but by filling them with something real. Something stronger than imagination, something true. The loner rancher who had waited so long for a slim bride realized at last that the best gift life had given him was not what he had asked for, but what he had been given: a partner whose heart and courage were bigger than any dream he had dared to write in a letter.